Hello, welcome to this week's podcast, the Royal Rota from ITV. We are with you every week. We have a guest this week. Let me introduce him in just a moment. But first of all, thank you for all your comments for last week's podcast. We had Mary Nightingale with us last week, who had lived and breathed the whole period following the announcement and of the Queen and the everything that happened afterwards. It was quite a mammoth episode, but I've had lots of people telling me they enjoyed the listen.
Yes, me too. So thank you if you've got in touch, and I'm glad we sort of managed to kind of capture what a sort of broad brush of the whole 12
easy,
days.
I mean, so much happened. It was just actually very difficult. We could have spoken for about 4 hours, but we decided to cut it to 45 minutes or so. But we're delighted that after the success of having a guest last week, we have another guest this week. Why didn't you introduce yourself?
My name is Valentine Low.
Now, Valentine Low, what have you been doing recently? You've put this, you've had a book out, is that right?
I believe I have,
yes.
Yeah.
Now, would we be right in calling it the book that everyone's talking about?
That's certainly what the Daily Mail called it, I'm very pleased to say.
But I think that's an accurate description, isn't it?
Yeah, it's certainly a lot of people talking about it, yeah.
Yes. So Valentine Low is the royal correspondent of the Times. You should be royal editor, surely, Val, with someone of your seniority.
Well, funny enough, strictly speaking, I'm not the royal correspondent. I mean, I am, but I don't have a title.
Well, we know you as a royal correspondent, but yes, right, you don't have that title.
I don't
Does that mean you can do other stories?
I can do other stories.
Right.
I rather like not having a title. I think it gives you a sort of freedom. It's rather grand not having a title.
Yes, you are just the Valentine Low. Yeah. You don't need a title, do you?
Low of the Times.
Yeah, and now you have a book as well. So you're an acclaimed author as well as a accomplished journalist.
Absolutely. Acclaimed author. My wife says she likes it.
Yeah, exactly. So the book, to use its official title, is Courtiers, and the subheading is The Hidden Power Behind the Crown.
That's right.
Now, if you've been reading the Times or the Mail, who've serialised your book, you'll know there's lots in it. Not just about what happened in 1952 with Alan Tommy Lascelles, but also what happened with a more recent and quite well-publicised exit from the royal family. Some people call Megxit, other people just call Harry and Meghan leaving the UK and relocating to the US. And Lizzie, it's been quite an interesting read, what we've found out so far.
A really, really fascinating read. And actually the quote on the back of the book is a quote from the Duchess of Sussex, isn't it, about why you might want to explore this as a topic.
Yeah, the quote on the back of the book, which of course I can't quote verbatim, but it's her talking about the difference between the royal family, the members of the family, and the institution. They're two separate things, which of course they are two separate things. But the implication, what she was saying then, was that the institution, i.e. the men in grey suits, they are responsible for so much of what went wrong.
So Val, just for people that don't know, will you just explain what a courtier is, what they do? There's a description of a courtier, sort of an old-fashioned courtier, at the start of the book. Will you just describe to our listeners what a courtier is, sort of then and now?
Certainly now, a courtier is someone who works for the royal family. They are advisors, essentially, and they control your official life. They arrange your diary. They write your speeches. They control who you see. They're the sort of gatekeepers. They can manage your life. They manage the official side of your life.
From the very top, from the Lord Chamberlain and the private secretaries down to those who might do, I don't know, would you call a footman a courtier?
No. A courtier is really
administrative.
A courtier is a member of the household.
Yes.
Now, certainly in Buckingham Palace, who is and who isn't a member of the household it's part of the great class structure within Buckingham Palace. They're members,
which still exists.
Yeah, yes. And I was once told, it's in the book, about someone who was quite senior in Kensington Palace working for William and Harry. They were invited to the annual diplomatic reception, which is the very posh white tie do at Buckingham Palace every year. And their deputy wasn't. And they asked, why isn't my deputy invited? And they were told, well, you're a member of the household, they're not.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, members of the working in Buckingham Palace, and this within living memory, probably going back to the 90s or so, members of the household used a different entrance to staff. So if you were an assistant press secretary, say, you went in the front of Buckingham Palace, what's known as the Privy Purse door. If you were just a press officer, a couple of rungs down, you went in through the side. You were going to exactly the same office, but used a different entrance.
Yes. There was also, you ate in different dining rooms, or at least at different times. Wasn't there?
There were different dining rooms,
Yes. Whether it was at St James's Palace or Buckingham Palace, or, very, very segregated, which actually, to be fair to the late Queen, it's something that she kind of worked through and tried to modernise, although I think some people might look at Buckingham Palace's structure and say there's nothing modern about it at all.
No.
Having said that, though, it is much more modern than perhaps it was in 1952 when she became Queen.
I mean, so, and the dining thing has become much more democratic.
Yes.
They've done away with what was known as household dining.
Yes.
They all eat in the same restaurant now.
How very modern of them. Now, listen, we know what Meghan thinks about the courtiers, because in that Oprah interview that she gave, and when you look back at that period, that very busy period for all of us as journalists, which kind of began when you broke the story about the bullying allegations and then rolled on into that week of the Oprah Winfrey interview, etc. But she herself was referring to the institution all the time, wasn't she? The institution of monarchy, in other words, those in grey suits that surround members of the royal family.
Yes, that's right. She wasn't used to dealing with an institution. I guess she dealt with other institutions. She dealt with sort of Hollywood, or the version of Hollywood that was in Toronto, but she wasn't really prepared for this. She wasn't really ready for the fact that she was joining something that was bigger than her.
And also how far down the pecking order she was, effectively. If you think that when she joined, the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh come first, then it was the Prince of Wales, as was Prince Charles and Camilla, then it was William and Kate, and then actually their household was the next rung down from that. Yeah,
and that's somewhere where you've got to have some sympathy for Harry and Meghan, actually, because, yes, in terms of line of succession, they are down the pecking order, but in terms of their star power
and profile,
and profile and pulling power, they were actually very high. And
you could say at the top.
Yes, exactly, and that, of course, was one of the problems.
Yeah. But the book looks at, doesn't it, what they attempted to do to try and make it work for Harry and Meghan, even before Meghan married into the royal family.
Yeah, I mean, there were two things. One is that shortly before they got married, Meghan had a meeting with this chap, Miguel Head, who you two both know. He was William's private secretary, incredibly nice man, incredibly sort of emotionally empathetic. And
yes, previous to that, a press secretary, wasn't he? That was before my time.
And he was previously press secretary. He'd
been a courtier.
Definitely a courtier. Yeah. And actually, just to digress slightly, if you don't mind, an interesting figure, because he comes from extremely humble roots. His Miguel's father was a post office clerk, and his mother ran a playgroup or something. I can't remember. But
I knew him when he worked at the Ministry of Defence, because when I worked in politics, he was in the political sphere before he leapt from one palace of Westminster to the other.
Yeah. So the kind of classic image of the courtier of someone who went to Eton and perhaps was a member of one of the smarter guards regiments.
Which for so many of them, particularly, well before Harry and Meghan's time, they were all Eton educated, all
look
members
at Jamie
of the
Lowther
military.
Pinkerton, look at...
just hundreds of them.
Hundreds of them.
And it's very funny, because it's not just public schools in general, it's Eton in particular. Loads of them went to Eton.
You say, don't you, quite, yep, really, another Etonian.
Exactly.
Yep, really, another.
So Miguel didn't fit that mould. And he had a meeting with Meghan, and he explained to her, listen, you're coming to the royal family from a different place. You're an actress, you've had a career, you're a grown-up. Yeah. And we can look at doing things a different way. He could have raised the question of whether she wanted to continue acting. She didn't. She'd already made that quite clear. But, he said maybe you could somehow be connected to the film industry in some other way, do something else. Yeah. I mean, he one of the things he referenced in that conversation was the way that William had worked as an air ambulance helicopter pilot, so earning a salary. That salary was in fact then paid to charity, but he was a kind of salaried person working for something outside the royal family that wasn't the military. So he said that, we are interested in doing things differently.
And for David Manning, didn't he? He looked at how potentially they could spend some time
Yeah,
abroad,
yeah,
like
exactly.
William
Manning
McKay
did
gone to Anglesey,
Yeah.
not abroad, but
Manning
but
wrote
not
this
in
paper
London.
suggesting
Anglesey is
the
an island
Queen
down in
and
North West Wales.
the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh had spent time in Malta. They looked at options for them to go abroad, didn't they?
Exactly. They looked at all that. So, they really wanted to try and help. And of course, the team around them, particularly sort of Sam Cohen, who became their private secretary when they got married. Sam, this Australian woman who'd worked for the Queen for a long time, but is one of the
Queen had a lot of respect for Samantha Cohen.
Anyone who's ever met Sam has respect for her.
Yeah.
She's a great, warm, lovely person, but
Diligent,
energetic,
trustworthy,
but also she's one of life's problem solvers.
Yeah.
Sam goes out there and makes something happen.
What are you saying, that if anyone could have made this work, it would have been Sam?
Yeah, very much.
The fact that they didn't work kind of probably proves that it was unworkable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was unworkable. I mean, I think one of the things about Harry and Meghan is, although what happened was pretty disastrous, I think it was inevitable that they would leave. I think the difference between what they wanted and what the royal family, particularly the Queen, in fact, felt they could put up with was the two sides were just too far apart.
You referenced that the Queen effectively gave them Samantha Cohen to be their private secretary because she was one of the Queen's assistants' private secretaries. We could also talk about the fact that a household was created for them when they split away from Kensington Palace and create their own household. They got their own head of communications, Sarah Latham. A lot. If you talk to people in the royal family, and this is only one side of the story, of course, but they will say they bent over backwards to make it work for Harry and Meghan. Obviously, Harry and Meghan will say, no, they didn't. They put barriers up in every possible direction you could think of.
Yeah, but there's something else I'd like to say, actually, is that, yes, I think a lot of people bent over backwards to try and help them. But, there's a big but. Anything that went wrong in the first year or so of Harry and Meghan's marriage. And in particular, I'd focus on the first 8 months of 2019. So that was in January of that year. That's when Meghan had these suicidal thoughts, which she talked about in her interview with Oprah Winfrey. And then going on to the late summer of that year.
To be clear, this is less than a year after their marriage. They were married in May 2018.
That's right. Then going on to later in 2019, when it became clear internally that they possibly were thinking of getting out, that they had eyes on getting out. In that period, no one really picked up on it. No one flagged it up that this couple were deeply unhappy, felt very frustrated in their situation. There was no big strategic meeting, and I'm talking about the most senior people in the institution. They didn't address the problem. I think they buried their heads in the sand.
Kind of what they did with Princess Margaret, you could say. Kind of what they did with Princess Diana. The royal family's got form here in terms of ignoring a problem until it gets so big, then they have to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah. And we could see it was a problem. Do you remember, Lizzie, when we were on tour, we did Australia, Fiji, Tonga, New Zealand. We could see Harry's unhappiness because he sort of wears his sentiments very obviously, doesn't he?
And actually, Val's book, the prologue, starts on that tour, doesn't it? On that plane journey, which I remember really clearly
you weren't
as
welcome.
well.
Explain that, because that was a very. It was like a sullen child being ordered by his mum to come to the back of the plane and thank Auntie Beryl for some socks for Christmas.
That's exactly it. So we're on the plane. We're coming from Tonga back to Sydney, and when you're on these royal tours, often you have a member of the royal family will come to the back of the plane, just informally, off the record, have a chat with the press, just shoot the breeze, say how things are going. It's an opportunity for some informal contact.
Yeah, laugh about something that happened or something that went wrong. That's the kind of conversations you have. It's not about, tell us all the gossip inside the royal family. That's not it. It's just a bit of it's an informal moment, isn't it?
We were promised that Harry and Meghan would come to the back of the plane, and this 5-hour flight, we waited and waited and waited, and they didn't show up. And it was only after the flight had landed
and taxied to a stop
that Harry and Meghan came out. And Meghan was beaming away, as she always does. She always puts her best face
It's
on.
that fixed face.
And Harry, as you say, he came forward. He looked like that sullen teenager forced by his parents to talk to somebody he doesn't want to talk to. And he says something like, "Thank you very much for coming, even though you weren't invited."
Okay, let's be clear here. Let's talk about the facts. Were we invited on this tour?
We were specifically invited.
Did we have an invitation to be there?
Yeah, we
yes.
had. Yeah. It was ludicrous.
Yeah,
it was
you weren't
rude.
invited. In other words, I didn't want you here. That's
Yeah.
pretty what he meant.
Yeah.
But things were falling apart behind the scenes, probably in a way that maybe we didn't realise quite how bad they were at the time.
Yeah.
But do you remember being in Fiji? Was it Fiji airport? It was boiling hot. There was a big long ceremony that went on for a good hour, an hour and a half. Harry had a face like thunder on him throughout the whole thing. Meghan had her fixed smile face on her, and you could just see that things weren't right.
I remember that clearly. He just spent the whole. I mean,
I remember being very hot at that point.
Let's be sympathetic. It was a long, boring welcome ceremony, and we'd already sat through.
No disrespect to Fiji, but it was quite long.
And we'd already sat through one of those the day before or 2 days before, when we actually arrived in the country.
That's right. In that park, wasn't it?
This was the second one, and Harry just had a face like thunder, and he spent the entire sort of hour or so of the ceremony just glowering over the press. We were off to the left. He was just looking over at us and just staring daggers at us.
Yeah. And at that point, I mean, let's be clear, at that point, we'd all written, in your case, or broadcast in our case, some, very positive things about the tour, how well received they were in Australia, how fantastic it was that they were in Fiji. No one had actually written or broadcast anything that should have upset him.
Yeah, and I remember I wrote a piece for the Times website, because we used to run this daily 1,000-word think piece, and I was asked to write one about Meghan at the beginning of the tour, and I wrote 1,000 words, which had a very prominent position on the website, all about how Meghan was a breath of fresh air for the royal family,
well, she was,
and she was having a different approach to this tour, and she was going down really well, and she was reshaping how a female member of the royal family could approach the role. Very, very positive piece.
Yes.
But you write in the book, don't you, about the tensions between the Sussexes and their team at the time on that tour.
And the aforementioned Samantha Cohen. Now, if you're going to start having tensions with your private secretary, who many people respect and the Queen herself respects, there are, as we said before, some unsolvable issues going on.
Yeah, I mean, I was told that Sam was shouted at on that tour and had a very difficult time. And David Manning, who's this former ambassador in Washington, who's their foreign affairs advisor and was on the trip, who's a very august figure, he apparently said, in this very mild way he said, "You're dealing with a very difficult lady," i.e. Meghan.
Yes, I think, I mean, and this, as we said, this was a sign that things were starting to go wrong. But actually, we should remind ourselves, this was 2018. The tour.
Yeah.
This was 6 months after they were married. They'd announced at the very beginning of that tour that she was pregnant. But it wasn't really until after the Southern Africa tour that obviously things went majorly wrong, and they left and they found their way out and all the rest of it. And you write at that point was their staff were at that time shattered, exhausted and shell-shocked. Basically, the Courtiers, which your book is about, just had reached the very end of their tether with Harry and Meghan. They could no longer work with them.
Yeah, and Samantha Cohen, who was always going to be there on a temporary basis, she was due to leave. She did leave at the end of the South Africa tour, and the relief on her face, apparently, it was absolutely, palpable. She was so pleased to get out. And another member of their team, Amy Pickrell, who was an assistant private secretary, when
she previously left, didn't she? She was one of those many staff who left.
She'd previously left.
Yeah.
I think Amy possibly had quite a hard time. When she left, the advice was, don't make it about Meghan. Don't make your departure about Meghan. So she, I think, reading between the lines, no one's explicitly said so, but reading between the lines, they cooked up a story about her going to be with her boyfriend in Germany. He had a job in Germany. But put it like this, within 3 months she was back again.
Well, she's now working for the Royal Foundation for William and Kate, isn't she? So
yeah.
But there's descriptions in the book, aren't there, about how the the team around them described working with Harry and Meghan. Terms like Sussex Survivors Club and narcissistic sociopath.
Yeah, that's
these were those who managed to get to the very end of the process and still remain in their jobs.
That's such a damning for your employees to be reduced to such a state where you refer to your boss as a narcissistic sociopath. It's pretty bad. And the other
an understatement, really.
The other astonishing phrase, they'd say, "We were played." That's how they regard having worked for Meghan.
Well, you're right that you think that when we're looking back and putting all the pieces together, it was clear that there was an exit strategy in place from quite early on. We're not just talking about November, December of 2019 when they went to Canada, which was their jumping off point for going to America. But you're kind of right that the suspicion was that this was the plan from quite early on.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite hard to be specific about that or to be firm about that but certainly what some people believe that she always wanted out. Now whether they're right or wrong, I don't know, but and certainly by sort of late summer of that year, 2019, I think they were pretty firm in their own minds about wanting to get out.
Yeah. And they went through that Africa tour, and it was started in South Africa. It included Angola when we did that. I mean, again, it was all very positive. He was, raising the profile of the Halo Trust, which was a charity very close to his mother's heart. He went to the, same place where she'd been, famously walking along that cleared area of landmines. Then there was Malawi, where they had a fantastic reception. They were talking about girls' education, the importance of, of schooling for girls. And then it was just at the very, very end when they announced this legal action against the associated newspapers, the publishers of the Mail on Sunday, and Tom Bradby, who was with us on that tour, did his interview with Meghan in the garden of the High Commission, or one of the High Commissions in Johannesburg. And I remember looking at the faces of the staff at the end of that day, and I would agree with the description that you describe in your book, shell-shocked. That was exactly what I saw on their faces. Exactly that.
Yeah. I think when when Harry and Meghan then went off to Canada in that autumn, I think the more astute members of staff thought to themselves, she's not coming back.
Yeah. Well, actually, you raised an important point there, because there was always this or we were led to believe at the time that Harry and Meghan hadn't told anyone in the royal family about this. There was a shock to his father, Prince Charles. It turns out that actually not that much of a shock, because there were emails between Harry and his father about the very fact that Harry wanted to leave.
Yes, the email sent while they were in Canada, while they were having this 6 week break in
Which
Canada.
was in kind of November, December. So therefore in January, when we got this, this bombshell news that they were leaving the royal family, well, it wasn't that much of a surprise to other members of the royal family.
It wasn't a bombshell in the sense they knew they wanted out. The bombshell was they
did it without telling anyone.
They hadn't agreed to put out a statement that night. That's what that's why the royal family felt they were blindsided. That's why Harry denies they're blindsided, because Harry says, well, they all knew we wanted out. Yeah. Yes, Harry, but they didn't know you were putting out a statement that night.
And that interview that, Lizzie, you remember it very well, don't you? The interview that Meghan did with Tom Bradby at that time, when she said, thank you for asking if I'm okay. No one's asked me if I'm okay. That was the very beginning. That was, again, her laying the groundwork for what she was about to say and do in future years, and the Oprah Winfrey interview that we all think has been in the planning for quite some considerable time. I mean, Tom's interview kind of opened up that call it a can of worms. It doesn't feel like a strong enough phrase.
It was just a sentence, really, wasn't it? But obviously that's been expanded on quite considerably since that sentence.
Thank you for
the
asking
sentiment about how unhappy they were.
Yeah, and it's quite a thing to go through, and they'd had Archie, and which obviously since found out that even there were issues on that tour with Archie's room catching a light, wasn't there? In the podcast, you said that recently.
But you write about how Harry, when they returned from Canada, had wanted to see the Queen, hadn't he, in early January, and was told that the diary wasn't available, would have to wait.
Yeah, the Queen initially agreed.
Yeah.
And then he was told later, oh, sorry, she made a mistake.
This is the courtiers getting
now
in the way.
the question is who? Yes, it is the assumption here that this is the courtiers.
100%. This is definitely the courtiers thinking completely understandably that it would be a big mistake to let Harry to let him at the Queen, because who knows what they might agree between them.
And is that therefore one example of where the power lies?
That's definitely one example of where the power lies. Presumably the Queen's private secretary, I don't know.
Well, we can name some of the courtiers. The Queen's private secretary then, and actually is still one of the private secretaries around the new king, is Sir Edward Young.
Sir Edward Young.
And then there's Clive Alderton, who was formerly the private secretary to Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, and is now one of the other private secretaries to the king. I'm not quite sure how that courtier hierarchy is working out as we speak. Because obviously it feels like it's in transition, that Edward Young is kind of handing over to
It's definitely in
Clive
transition. It's definitely Edward handing over to Clive. Because
these were the people that would have put those blocks in the way that Meghan referred to as the men in suits.
They definitely would have put those blocks in the way. And I think it's completely understandable why they'd want to do that. But the mistake they made was failing to appreciate how much it would wind Harry and Meghan up.
Yeah.
How much it angered. Because, as I wrote in the book, Harry and Meghan felt sort of cornered, misunderstood, schemed against as well. And to sort of persuade the Queen to change her mind like that was just the sort of thing that was going to enrage him.
But do you think, actually, the Queen would ever have at least considered them becoming part-time royals, one foot in, one foot out?
No, and you write about this, don't you, how there were meetings of courtiers from across the different households on how they could come up with a solution for Harry and Meghan. And actually, when it came to it, and all these different A, B, C options were put...
Yeah, they decided it was all or nothing.
It was the Queen that said, no, this doesn't work, because you cannot be half in, half out.
It was definitely the Queen who made the ultimate decision. So these courtiers they're very powerful, but you have to remember that ultimately the ultimate decision making is with the sovereign. Yeah.
Actually, I heard that there were some very senior courtiers who, on the night of the Oprah Winfrey interview, and I don't know, did you stay up through the night to listen to it, or did you?
Yeah.
Yes, so we all stayed up through the night to listen to it. So too they did at Buckingham Palace as well, and three of the most senior courtiers stayed up through the night and therefore reported back to the Queen about what had been said. And the Queen's response was, I'm going to wait and watch this on ITV as it was that night at 9 o'clock and watch it like the rest of the country is going to watch it, and then on the Tuesday I'll tell you what I think. That was a real indication about the Queen kind of took her time. She was never going to be rushed into giving a statement.
Exactly.
And obviously that famous statement that came out in response was recollections may vary. But it was quite interesting that even, it was her decision. She took the advice of the courtiers who, like us, stayed up through the night to watch it. But no, she wanted to watch it go out in real time with the rest of the country.
That statement was ready by 5 o'clock. Between the interview being broadcast in the States and before it going out in the UK, that statement was ready, and the Queen said no.
No, I'm going to watch it myself. And then obviously okayed the statement after she had watched it as well. But I thought that was very interesting how she took her time. She wasn't going to be rushed. She wasn't going to meet the demands of the 24-hour news cycle. She was going to respond.
94-year-old woman still ruled the roost.
And there are other examples in the book, aren't there, about other times when the principals, as we call them, the bosses, have said no. And one example you give is Prince Charles, as he was then, his speech on architecture.
Yes, so this is back in the 1980s, 84, I think. Charles had already been battling on this architecture front for a little while. He was very keen on community architecture, very keen on traditional methods, traditional materials.
Think pound brie. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he was off to present some award at some gala dinner celebrating, I think, possibly the 150th anniversary of the Royal Institute of British Architects. And he was basically there just say a few nice words and present a prize. But instead, he had this incendiary speech, which he severely criticised two forthcoming projects, architectural buildings that were forthcoming. One of them was the extension to the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. And in his speech, he was going to call that a monstrous carbuncle.
Yes, famous monstrous carbuncle.
And his private secretary at the time, who was called Edward Dean, who was interesting figure because he actually came from a long dynasty of courtiers, but his father and his grandfather had been courtiers. He desperately tried
son of Michael Dean, wasn't he?
He was son of Michael Dean and grandson, I think, of Lord Stamfordham. He tried to. I think he had quite a strongly worded exchange of views with Charles about trying to get him don't give this speech. He lost that one. Charles made the speech and it caused a furious row. A lot of architects still haven't forgiven Charles for that.
Although there are many people who might agree with him, of course, as well. So,
and Adine did not stay for an awful lot longer after that. It was one of the straws that broke the camel's back.
Well, while we're in the process of rewinding, let's rewind a bit further. So obviously when the Queen became Queen in 1952 after the death of her father, she inherited his private secretary, Alan Lascelles, Tommy Lascelles, who'd previously served not just King George VI, but also King George V and Edward VIII. I mean,
three kings and a queen.
Couldn't get a man with much more experience than that.
I mean, Lascelles was a fascinating character.
He was the ultimate man in a suit.
Yeah, because he'd first worked for Edward VIII when he was Prince of Wales, and stayed with him. And handling that Prince of Wales made handling Harry look like a absolute sinecure. He was always chasing women and
having parties
and behaving incredibly badly. And Lascelles put up with it for a while, but eventually he could take it no more, and resigned. And would say he had a meeting with Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, Lascelles did, and basically said this man is unfit to be king, and if on one of his point-to-point races he should fall off his horse and break his neck, I secretly think it would be rather a good thing. And Baldwin said, frankly, I agree.
Right.
Absolutely extraordinary stuff. So,
and what happened in 1936?
So what happens? Lascelles goes off and does something else for a few years, and then is enticed back to the royal family to work for George V in what turns out to be the last months of George V's reign, as an assistant private secretary. George V dies, and what happens? Lascelles finds himself...
The guy he said is unfit to be king.
He finds himself working for him as king, but it sort of seems...
But not for very long, obviously.
Not for very long. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, that is the 1936 is a subject of a podcast all in itself, of course.
But he had quite a lot of influence, didn't he, over Princess Margaret and her relationship with Peter Townsend. He had quite a lot of influence over the Windsor name, didn't he? And it's you set out quite early the sort of influence these courtiers had.
Yes, he was incredibly important. When Margaret wanted to marry Peter Townsend, who, as we all remember, was divorced, and therefore this was highly controversial at the time. Now we're all used to sort of...
Well, we have a queen consort and a king who had previous marriages, of course, now.
Exactly, we're all used to it now, but back in 1952 we weren't so used to it. And in a nutshell, Lascelles hid from Margaret the fact that Margaret was told, if you delay for 2 years, you might be able to marry Peter Townsend.
And you hit 25, wasn't it?
Yeah. So delay for 2 years, you can marry Peter Townsend, possibly. What he hid from her was the government, in a cabinet meeting, had said that even if she still wants to marry him in two years' time, when she's allowed to do so, we still won't approve, and therefore she could only do it through losing her role, giving up her royal privileges. And that crucial bit of information that in those 2 years won't make a difference was hid from Margaret, and Margaret never forgave Lascelles for that.
I mean, You also think about the power that they had. I mean, someone like Lascelles had at the time. 1952, the Queen's 25 years old. She's a woman in a man's world. She was very inexperienced, hadn't had, a proper education, in the way in which others might have done at the time. And yet, so therefore, his advice to the Queen then would have been very powerful advice, because until she got more experience herself, she's much more likely to take it.
Yeah, and there's an incredibly powerful image that Lascelles sums up. So there's at the beginning of the Queen's reign, there's a bit of a fuss about what the name of the family should be, because it has up till then been the House of Windsor.
What from the middle of the First World War, when they decided having a German name wasn't very good.
Exactly. So
yes.
from 1917, I think it is, it's been the House of Windsor. Queen comes to the throne, she's got a husband.
Yeah.
Husband whose family name is Mountbatten. And Lord Mountbatten, who was Philip's uncle, had said in a jocular moment in a private dinner party, the House of Mountbatten now ruled, which got back to the palace, caused all sorts of ructions. They didn't like this at all. So there was a big debate. What's the name? Is it going to be the House of Mountbatten? Is it going to be the House of Windsor? The decision was made. It's the House of Windsor.
Yes.
Philip did not like that one bit.
Which is why actually Charles and Anne had a different surname to Andrew and Edward, because they were born 10 years later, weren't they? When's Prince Andrew born in 1950 or something, wasn't he? And therefore they're Mountbatten Windsors, aren't they?
Right, yeah, so that would explain that.
Yes.
Anyway, so when the Queen finally signed whatever it is she had to sign, making it quite plain that it was the House of Windsor, Lascelles described himself as standing over her like one of the barons at Runnymede. That's a reference to King John signing the Magna Carta in 1215. And this image of Lascelles standing over the Queen like one of the barons at Runnymede is such a powerful image. It's say, in this instance, I am powerful and I have told the Queen what to do.
So yes, Windsor became Mountbatten Windsor, and obviously that's a name for even today that they give to children like Archie and Lilibet. That's their full titles, isn't it?
Exactly.
So, actually, talking of names, we still haven't had a decision on whether or not Archie and Lilibet, being now as they are the grandchildren of the monarch, whether they are going to be HRHs and prince and princesses. That has not yet been decided, and I would have thought that we would have had some clarity on that so far.
Yeah, I find that very puzzling, because all the rules say that they are. Just because you have a title doesn't mean to say you have to use it.
Yes.
But
you do automatically. Now, given that this is an institution, as Megan liked to call it, which is a stickler for the rules, well, if the rules say that the grandchildren of the monarch should be known as their Royal Highnesses, Prince or Princess, then you would have thought that someone would have updated the website, when they haven't.
You would have thought, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, interesting point.
Just coming back off Harry and Meghan,
yes, we
slip back onto them. And back to the book. I found it really interesting, the relationship between the personal relationship. Not only do you have to be brilliant in your job, but you also had to get on personally very well with your boss to have an effective working relationship.
Yeah,
was the impression
exactly.
I got.
That's very important, and that's something which Sir Clive Alderton, does so cleverly and so well with Charles. He's worked for him a long time. I mean, he's been private secretary since 2015, 16, something like that. But before immediately before that, he was ambassador in Morocco. But before that, he worked for Charles for quite a long time as private secretary in charge of foreign affairs and deputy private secretary. So he's worked with him, and he knows how to handle Charles.
Yeah.
He knows what Charles wants. He's very effective at making sure Charles gets what he wants, and he's got this crucial thing. He can make Charles and Camilla laugh. It's very good at diffusing what might otherwise be awkward situations.
How do you think the new courtiers are? Well, they're the existing courtiers, but in terms of the new setup at Buckingham Palace, and when I say new setup, I mean we have a king and a queen consort now. How do you think that's going to be different to the setup that we had with the late queen?
Well, there's one.
Work ethic for a start. I mean, I'm not saying the Queen didn't work hard, but King Charles is famously known for burning the candle into the early hours of the morning doing his work. And
and there's someone called Malcolm Ross, Lieutenant Colonel, I think, Sir Malcolm Ross, who had been the comptroller in Buckingham Palace for the Queen, so he's basically in charge of ceremonial stuff. And then he retired from the palace, and then he went to go and work for Charles in some capacity or other, I forget which, Master of the Household, I think. And he said something like, in my first weekend of working for Charles, I had sort of 17 calls over the weekend. In my entire time working for Her Majesty, I had 5 throughout my career.
And there's a difference, because that's what Charles is. He's a man in a hurry, isn't he? And he wants to get stuff done.
He is.
And it's been explained to me by courtiers before that King Charles, as we obviously now call him, is someone who just sees something that he wants to affect change, or knows that he's in a position to affect change, and wants it done immediately. And so he'll go on a visit, and off the back of that visit there'll be a list of 5 or 6 things that he thinks that he can action, or he knows people who might be able to action, or he can get heads together in the same room. And that's the way in which he works, isn't it? Because he's a convener.
And what's interesting is that trait was inherited a bit by Harry. Because Harry is someone who wants instant results. And the difference between Harry and William is much more strategic and thinks much more of the long term. And how can we get things done in the long term? What's our strategy here? And Harry wants it done tomorrow.
And you talk about, don't you, the change, actually, the evolution, and how William wanted a very different type of setup, a less stuffy, a less formal setup than perhaps had come previously.
Sure, you were allowed to go into the office without your suit and tie, you mean?
Yeah.
So,
Heaven
forbid you could go to work without a suit and tie.
There was a period when the kids were young. I don't know how it is exactly now, but William told his staff, listen, it started off with slightly casual Fridays and then developed from there. William said, if you don't have a meeting, if you haven't got someone coming in, or you're not allowed to go and do something, please do not wear a suit, because my kids are sort of running around the corridors here, and I want this to have the atmosphere of a family home. And
not a stuffy old office.
I don't want stuff. But there was a fascinating little sort of vignette, as it were, that when William and Harry were quite young, so young men, probably, I guess, still in the military, and they had quite a small team around them. It was very informal then. They used to sit around the sofa. Harry and William often be very informally dressed. They and their courtiers would, 3 or 4 people this was, would have pizza together,
drink green tea. And
it's
like working for Google.
But when William and Harry would come into the room, these chaps would get up, they'd stand up when Harry and William came in the room, and Harry and William would always say, no, please don't do that. And this went on and on. They kept on saying, please don't do that. And they just kept on standing up, because they wanted them to get used to the idea of this is how people are going to treat you.
Yeah.
You're a member of the royal family, and people are going to get up, are going to stand up when you come in the room. And they thought it was important. They should get used to that. And eventually Harry and William stopped saying, because they just gave up. They'd lost that battle.
But actually, we were talking earlier about when sometimes members of the royal family come to the back of a plane if you're on tour with them. And we stand up and we might have a quick chat. If you ever look around behind us where all the military sit on the plane, they're always standing up. Now, sometimes they do go down and talk to them, but even when the royal family are just in that half of the plane, the bit that we sit in, all the military at the back standing up. And I find that really kind of strange, because we, members of the press, we like to think that we're less deferential, but members of the military, they're always on their feet.
Talking of Harry and William, someone that used to work with them was Jamie Lowther Pinkerton, who actually, I hadn't realised he started his time with the Queen Mother, and this is I love this story in the book about the pea flicking. Yeah,
so Jamie was then an officer with the Irish Guards. The Queen Mother either always or often had her equerries from the Irish Guards, the mix, and it was a bit of a tradition. And so here he was, age 23, he turns up to meet the Queen Mother for the first time, and he has lunch with her, and he's quite nervous. And the Queen Mother, bless her, detects his nervousness, and they're sitting in the dining room of Clarence House, I guess, and she says to him, have you ever flicked peas?
Because there's a chandelier.
And there's a crystal chandelier, which is the bulge. When I was a girl, she said, I used to be able to get 3 out of 4 into that chandelier. Go on, have a go. So Lowther Pinkerton gets his fork and flicks peas at the crystal bowl of the chandelier, misses by a mile, and the Queen Mother's Private Secretary, Martin Gillett, absolutely roars with laughter. I
love the idea of a 23-year-old flicking peas at
the ice was broken.
Yeah, and actually went on to become William and Harry's private secretary, didn't he, Jamie Lowther Pinkerton? He was a guest on ITV when we had our programme for covering the Queen's funeral, and was telling many a story about his time with the late Queen Mother.
Which couldn't be more different from the story about the umbrella.
The story about the umbrella.
Which is the other end of the spectrum of, probably not putting somebody at ease.
Yeah. So this was the Queen was visiting Richmond Castle, and it was raining, and the press secretary or communication secretary, James Roscoe, realised they'd forgotten an umbrella. She was about to arrive. So there was a lot of military around, and he went up to a group of officers and said, look, I'm dreadfully sorry, could you help me find an umbrella? We haven't got an umbrella for the Queen, and she's about to arrive. And ideally, someone would hold it as well. And they're about to do this, and the Duke of York, Prince Andrew, rocks up and says to this chap, if you go and get your own blinking umbrella.
I think the language was a little fruity than that, wasn't it?
He may have used slightly fruity language in that. And it's an extraordinary bit of extraordinary behaviour by Andrew. I mean, this chap was just very civilised, in a very civilised way, trying to ask the military to help. Anyway, about a week later, Roscoe was with the Queen. And the Queen says, did you ask the Duke of York to fetch you an umbrella? And Roscoe, of course, who had not asked the Duke of York to fetch an umbrella, Roscoe said, no, ma'am, do you think I would ask the Duke of York to fetch me an umbrella? And there the matter was laid to rest. So clearly Prince Andrew had realised that shouting and swearing at the Queen's communication secretary was possibly not a good way to behave, and he thought he'd better get his revenge in first, in case Roscoe sneaked on him. Yes.
Well, Prince Andrew, you hear many stories about Prince Andrew, but probably not some of them aren't for the discussions right now.
But actually, if I could, there is actually one story which, in a way, reflects well on Andrew, and it's kind of relevant to the book and the relationship between Courtiers and the royal family.
Saying.
So he had an idea of staging a charity tennis tournament to be played on the courts of Buckingham Palace, and he suggested it to the courtiers, and they all said no. They said it's a terrible idea for whatever reason. We have the public in here, whatever.
Just a no.
Just no. Andrew thought, blow this, and he went to the Queen, put it to her, and she said yes, and it went ahead, and it was a great success.
Yeah.
So two things. One is the courtiers, they can say no, but they're not always right.
Yeah.
And you can get around them by going straight to mummy.
By going
straight to the boss.
Straight
to the boss.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, we were this week. I saw you earlier in the week at Prince William's speech that he gave to United for Wildlife, which was his first. It was billed as his first keynote speech of being the new Prince of Wales. We've also had William and Kate's first visit to Wales as the Prince and Princess of Wales. There's lots of firsts at the moment. We were in Scotland with the King on Monday, I think it was. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. But in terms of William's speech, putting this particular subject, the illegal wildlife trade, and more broadly the natural world, we are seeing William setting out his stall to say he's going to pick up where his father left off.
Our natural world is one of our greatest assets. It is a lesson I learned from a young age from my father and my grandfather, both committed naturalists in their own right, and also from my much-missed grandmother, who cared so much for the natural world. In times of loss, it is a comfort to honour those we miss through the work we do. And I take great comfort than from the progress we're making to end the illegal wildlife trade. 8 years ago, we set out to develop a solution to one of the largest, yet often overlooked, international crimes blighting our world. A crime that robs us all of our most precious natural resources and funds organised crime, the harms of which are often directly felt by the most vulnerable communities. And a crime that this year felt especially brutal. The devastating news about Ranger Anton Mzimba is shocking confirmation of how vicious the illegal wildlife trade is. Anton dedicated himself to the protection of wildlife, undertaking his role diligently and professionally, despite threats to his life. He stood up to violent criminals and paid the ultimate price. It is only right that we pay tribute to him and all the other selfless rangers and frontline conservationists here today. And it is also only right that we honour him by continuing our work with renewed focus and vigour.
We know the King can't campaign in the same way they did before, and he said as much in his address after the Queen died. And is it your impression, as it was ours, I think, that this is William saying, look, this is going to be one of my core issues. I'm going to keep fighting on the environment, just like my father did.
I see it in a slightly different way to you. I think this is definitely William saying, I'm going to fight on these campaigning issues. But I think it's not him saying he's doing it like his father was. He's saying, I will continue to do this like I have been doing.
In my way, yes.
And because William has got a very different approach to his father. His father has been much more confrontational. His father's picked fights.
Yes. And some of those have led to him being pilloried in newspapers in the 1980s, for example, for hugging trees and things.
And in particular, I'm thinking of China.
Yeah.
Where over the Tibet issue, Charles has boycotted banquets. And William, in contrast, has engaged with China over the illegal wildlife trade. William has got a very different, he's much more collaborative approach than Charles has had. And I think watch this space, because I think
that's going to be quite interesting. But he referenced, didn't he? He said he got his love for the natural world from a very young age from his father and grandfather, and then he also said, and also his
much
missed grandmother.
But I don't think we should be surprised that William is going to continue the focus on the environment. I think, when he developed the Earthshot Prize, that for him was a life's work, and it was going to be for him sort of this, similar to his father's Prince's Trust or his grandfather's Duke of Edinburgh Award. He's really going to commit to that for
his life.
Well,
he signed up for a decade because it's a 10-year project, isn't it?
I think what we're seeing though is, we shouldn't underestimate that his first speech as the Prince of Wales, he chose to make it on that issue. That shows that commitment. But also this week we've seen them doing a whole range of engagements on issues that they have been focusing on.
Early years, maternity units,
sport, wildlife,
suicide prevention, mental health.
But also you have to note they've been doing an absolutely focused job of ticking the boxes of the four corners of the Union.
Yes.
Definitely.
So the King and Queen in Scotland.
The very first, reiterate this, the very first visit was to Scotland for the King and Queen. And that they didn't go unnoticed, not by people in Scotland or by any of us.
Exactly, particularly when you consider that during the kind of mourning period for the Queen, Scotland had featured very heavily because the Queen had died in Scotland. Yeah. So back straight up again, and then...
Dunfermline and Edinburgh.
In Wales, in Anglesey and Swansea, and then
Northern Ireland today.
Northern Ireland today.
So and then they need to sort of fan out to do it across, because we've been focused a lot on where will the King first go on tour, where will his first foreign engagement be, but actually they've got a job to do in the four nations of the UK before they start venturing abroad.
And actually, only a week or two ago, I was talking to someone very well informed about what the King's first year might be, and they said they thought there'll be a lot of focus on the Union, and they were absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's quite clear.
Well, so therefore, I was quite surprised myself. We were in Dunfermline. There was a massive crowd of people there because my view sometimes is that the love for the royal family might not be as strong in Scotland as it is in other parts of the United Kingdom. But I have to say, Dunfermline High Street absolutely ram-packed to see the new King and Queen consort.
And we have seen a lot of
And the Union flag was flying. You don't see that in Scotland very often these days.
But we've seen a lot of the King and Queen consort and the Prince and Princess of Wales meeting people. They have clearly wanted to get out and meet as many members of the public as they can. We've seen a lot of walkabouts on their visits, and the reception that they've had back has been really warm. And
some fascinating history to be learnt at Dunfermline Abbey. Where the burial site of Robert the Bruce, of course, Battle of Bannockburn, 1314, and all the rest of it. But actually, the King Malcolm III's wife, Queen Margaret, was canonised. She became Saint Margaret and was buried at Dunfermline Abbey. So it's the burial site of lots of Scottish kings and queens. But I read this week, which was rather disturbing, that Queen Mary of Scots had Saint Margaret's head removed after she was buried there and taken to Edinburgh Castle because it was meant to be good luck for childbirth. Now, I have to say, of all the things that are good luck for childbirth, I wouldn't have thought that was one of them. But, the things you learn about what these kings and queens did in the past.
You're out of touch with your folk remedies. But it just came back to the king and queen. It's very noticeable, certainly, in particularly with him. It's almost he feeds off crowds. He feeds off it. I mean, we saw it in Scotland, and I did a job with him when he was still Prince of Wales in South London a few months back.
Oh, the one, the JD Sports,
JD Sports, and there was absolute mob out there. Charles was getting mobbed, but he was completely unfazed by it. And was thriving off it, and they responded very well to him, and he responded well to them. It's great.
I agree with you. I think this whole thing about do people from the more diverse communities in the UK support the royal family? Well, if you look at the evidence from South London, also look at the evidence from the Palace of Holyrood House this week on Monday, when there were a lot of people from the British Asian Trust there to meet the Prince. They were talking to people in the room. They were so excited about him being there.
Yeah, but I think I'll just offer one sort of note of caution on all that. I think it's easy to get misled, to be seduced by what you see in front of your eyes, because it's a self-selecting audience. These are the people
who chose to go there.
Well, they're the enthusiasts. They're the people who want to see them. There's and I'm thinking particularly of Scotland here.
Well, it's a very valid point, because Nicola Sturgeon was booed, and that took a lot of people by surprise in Dunfermline. Even I was talking to some of the photographers who work in Scotland and photograph Nicola Sturgeon all the time. They were taken aback by the booing that Nicola Sturgeon got when she arrived at Dunfermline city chambers. But you have to say, this is a crowd who have decided to go and stand there and wait for a king and queen consort to turn up. That suggests they're going to be slightly more pro-union perhaps than the average crowd in Scotland.
Yes, that's
so
fair,
self-selecting, as you rightly point out.
We should play a little bit of the King's speech in Dunfermline. They were there because it had a nice link to the late Queen, actually. It was one of 8 places to be made a city as part of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. So he made that link back to the late Queen in his speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, my wife and I are immensely proud to be able to share this historic moment with you. I was delighted when in May this year it was announced that Dunfermline was one of the 8 communities being granted city status to mark the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee. There could be no more fitting way to mark my beloved mother's extraordinary life of service than by granting this honour to a place made famous by its long and distinguished history and by the indispensable role it has played in the life of our country.
Of course, one of the speeches that the King made when he was still Prince of Wales was a very powerful one, again in Scotland, in Glasgow, when he was at COP26. He was kind of like a star player there, but also then we had a Prime Minister who was a bit more keen on green things than the current Prime Minister as well. But COP27 and all this stuff about the king's been told or ordered or agreed, whatever form of words or verb you want to use, that he can't go to Egypt for COP27. He was always going to go as Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, but as king, first bit of tension with the government, or a first bit of realisation that he's got a new job and he can't be the person he was?
I think there's a strong element of realisation he can't be the person he was, and I don't get the sense that Charles has made a fuss about this. It may not be the decision he really wanted, but I don't think he's made a fuss about it. But I have heard that there's another interpretation on this, that they think that the government thinks that Charles's first visit abroad as king has a huge amount of kudos attached to it, and therefore, and the government doesn't necessarily want to blow that on a COP meeting. They think there may be more valuable, higher profile
places
things.
he could go.
From the guidance we've had, they are going to have to think incredibly carefully about where that first visit abroad is.
I think we said last week, is if you shoot off to a realm country, be that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or Antigua, or whatever, or Jamaica, it looks like you're desperately trying to say, please don't, become a republic. Everything's got a story behind it. Everything's got some meaning attached to it.
Everything will be scrutinised. Yeah.
I wonder whether he's going to end up in somewhere like Ireland, where he thinks a country he loves, the island of Ireland, and do a visit both north and south of the border, and whether or not he thinks he can effectuate some change there, particularly in Northern Ireland, where there is political stalemate at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean,
Ireland, France, Germany.
I mean, Canada, I've heard mentioned more than once.
Didn't he just been to Canada, though? We were with him there quite recently, weren't we?
The Telegraph has mentioned France as a possibility.
So as you rightly say, the very first visit abroad is going to have a lot of significance and meaning attached to it, and you've got to get that right. And I'm not sure they've themselves decided where that is at the moment.
No,
but he did clearly set out in that first address he gave to the nation that he showed an awareness that he knew that his role had changed, and we are seeing that now.
Yes, absolutely. So Val, before we wrap up with you, and thank you very much for joining us, it's been a real pleasure having you here and chewing the fat over so many subjects. How have you found being an author as opposed to being a not royal correspondent at the Times, as you explained earlier?
It's been fascinating. It's been fascinating having to go around being interviewed, sort of interviewing people I've been interviewed.
Bit of a celebrity. I thank you very much for
We've loved having you. Thank you.
I've loved being here.
So how have you found writing for a book deadline, which is kind of like 3 months ahead of you? Are you good at that? Are you self-disciplined? Do you write 1,000 words a day or whatever?
I'm quite disciplined. I work out how many words I need to do a day, or how many chapters
Divide it by how many days you've got left.
Yeah.
Give yourself a few at the end there.
And I managed to keep to that. But what of course I'm not used to. So as a journalist, you write something, it goes to the news desk, they might have a little tinker, it goes to the sub-editors, they might have a further tinker, and that's it.
Yeah.
All over in a couple of hours. Book, it goes to the editor, comes back, goes back,
rewriting,
rewrite, bits change, bits cut, back and forth, then it goes to the copy editor, then it goes to the proof. It's just endless process, and at every stage of this process, it's always improved.
Right, well that's good. Well, at least you're saying it's improved. It wasn't made worse, so that's a good thing.
Well, I mean, congratulations. It's a really fascinating read.
Thank you to Val for being on the podcast this week, and I'm not around next week for a podcast, so you're more than entitled to do one on your own if you wish to, or we will rejoin you in 2 weeks. So that decision will be made at some point in the coming days. Lizzie's decision, everyone, not mine. And we will see you next week. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Val for coming in and being such.
Thank you for having me.
Being such an amazing guest.